A woman of 42 should know when the music is no longer meant for her. The words floated across Bellweather Assembly Hall beneath the final notes of the waltz, soft enough to pretend they had not been spoken, sharp enough to reach Margaret Hale where she stood beside the refreshment table. She did not turn. Years had taught her that cruelty often wore perfume and smiled behind a lace fan. Instead, she adjusted the ribbon at the waist of her nephew's young fiancé, straightened a silver tray no one had noticed was crooked, and made certain the elderly widow near the fire had a chair. Everyone required something from Margaret. No one asked what she required in return. At 42, she had become useful in the way old clocks were useful, dependable, familiar, and rarely admired unless they stopped. The celebration belonged to Thomas, the boy she had raised since her sister's death, and to the bright young woman who would soon become his wife. Margaret had arranged the flowers, balanced the accounts, repaired the bride's veil, and persuaded the musicians to remain an extra hour without charging the family another dollar. When the final waltz began, couples moved toward the floor in a sweep of silk and polished shoes. No one approached Margaret. No one ever did. Poor Miss Hale, another woman whispered. She was once considered quite lovely. Margaret placed the last glass of punch on the table. Once was a small word with remarkable power. It could bury beauty, possibility, even a woman's future, while sounding almost kind. She stepped into the corridor before anyone could offer her the humiliation of pity. Beyond the tall windows, rain silvered the dark street and blurred the lanterns along the square. Bellweather looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, every roof leaked, every family owed someone money, and 43 children depended upon a school that survived because Margaret refused to let it fail. She rested one hand against the cold window glass. For 20 years, she had delayed every journey, every dream, every selfish wish. She had stopped waiting for life to ask anything new of her. Then the great doors opened. Wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing one candle and setting the others trembling. A tall man entered in a black traveling coat, rain shining across his shoulders. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face carried the composed severity of someone accustomed to rooms becoming silent when he crossed them. Behind him came a servant holding a leather document case marked with the Blackwood crest. Margaret recognized him before anyone announced his name. Nathaniel Blackwood, Duke of Ravensshire, owner of half the land surrounding Bellweather and nearly all the reasons its councilmen spoke carefully. His steel-gray eyes moved across the hall, passed over the dancers, and stopped on Margaret standing alone by the window. For one suspended moment, neither spoke. Then he approached. "Miss Hale, Your Grace." His gaze lingered on her face as though he had expected someone older, weaker, easier to dismiss. "I have come regarding the schoolhouse on Mill Road." The music faded behind them. Margaret saw the sealed paper in his hand and understood before he continued. "The property will be reclaimed by the Blackwood estate at the end of the month." She did not flinch. Reclaimed for what purpose? A transport road serving the northern quarry. And the children? Alternative arrangements may be considered. By whom? His expression cooled. That matter does not alter the decision. Margaret looked past him toward the ballroom, where the people who had pitied her were now listening. Then she met the Duke's eyes. "Then Your Grace has arrived precisely in time to become the most hated man in Bellweather." By 7 the next morning, Margaret was already inside the schoolhouse on Mill Road, kneeling beside the iron stove with a bundle of kindling in her hands. Rain tapped against the patched roof, and cold air slipped through the window frames no matter how carefully she stuffed the gaps with folded cloth. The children would arrive within the hour. Before then, the room had to be warm, the slates wiped clean, and the account book balanced. Margaret moved through the familiar tasks without hurry. She filled the water pitcher, divided 3 loaves of bread into equal portions, and placed the smallest pieces near the seats of the children who always claimed they had eaten breakfast. On her desk waited a list of unpaid fees, 2 requests for medicine, a letter from the town council asking her to reduce expenses, and a note from Thomas thanking her for making the engagement celebration perfect. She read his note twice. Then she tucked it beneath the inkstand where no one would see how much it mattered. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks entered carrying a basket of books beneath one arm. "You should have stayed in bed after last night. The alphabet has never postponed itself for fatigue." Eleanor set the basket down and studied her friend. The Duke truly means to close us. He means to reclaim the land. That sounds cleaner. Margaret looked toward the rows of small desks. Power often does. The first children arrived through the rain, coats damp, cheeks red from the cold. Margaret greeted each one by name. Clara wanted to become a doctor. Benjamin drew bridges in the margins of his arithmetic pages. Ruth could recite every capital city she had ever been taught, but still hid whenever strangers entered the room. Margaret remembered all of it. She remembered whose father had lost work, whose mother could not read, who needed an extra piece of coal sent home at dusk. By noon, she had taught fractions, corrected spelling, written a letter for a widow seeking relief, and settled an argument without raising her voice. No one watching would have called her life empty. Yet every hour belonged to someone else. After the children left, Margaret returned to the small stone house she shared with Thomas. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and cooling bread. His boots stood near the door, polished for his new life. She paused beside them, proud and strangely hollow. For nearly 20 years, she had built her days around his needs. Soon, he would no longer need her. In her bedroom, she opened the bottom drawer of an old walnut chest. Beneath folded linens lay a faded train ticket to New York, purchased when she was 22. She had meant to leave Bellweather with a teaching position waiting across the ocean, but her aunt had fallen ill, and then her sister had died, leaving Thomas with no one else. Margaret had postponed the journey for a month, then a year, then a lifetime. She ran one finger over the worn paper. The ink had faded, but the destination remained visible. New York. Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. You still keep it. Margaret did not turn. Throwing it away would make the decision seem final. Was it not? Margaret closed the drawer. Everything becomes final if one waits long enough. A carriage stopped outside. Through the window, she saw the Blackwood crest on the door. The Duke stepped down beneath a dark umbrella, his expression as severe as the morning sky. Margaret straightened her dress and went to meet him. He had come to inspect the school. She had no intention of making the task easy. Nathaniel entered the schoolhouse as though he were inspecting a warehouse, his gaze moving from the patched ceiling to the uneven floorboards, then to the narrow stove struggling against the damp morning chill. Margaret watched him take in the room without allowing his expression to reveal whether he saw hardship or merely expense. The building requires more repairs than the estate report indicated, he said. The estate report was written by a man who has never stood here during winter. Nathaniel looked at her. You object to accuracy? I object to distance pretending to be accuracy. Mrs. Brooks quietly excused herself, leaving them among the rows of empty desks. Nathaniel opened the leather case carried by his secretary and removed several maps. A red line crossed directly through the school grounds. The proposed road will shorten transport from the quarry by nearly 8 miles. How fortunate for the stone. The project will employ more than 60 men and displace 43 children. Another building can be found. Margaret folded her hands. Where? That is a matter for the town council. The council has searched for 3 years. This is the only property near enough for the younger children to reach on foot. Nathaniel traced the road on the map. The estate cannot abandon a profitable development because the town has failed to plan. You call it failure because you have never needed to choose between a roof and a book. Before he could answer, the door opened and the children entered in a rush of damp coats and bright voices. They stopped when they saw him. Margaret introduced Nathaniel without mentioning why he had come. He remained near the back wall while the lesson began. At first, he watched with polite impatience. Margaret wrote a question on the slate and asked each child to describe the life they hoped to build. Clara raised her hand first. I want to become a doctor. Nathaniel glanced at the girl's worn shoes. Why? My mother was sick last winter, and the nearest doctor was 12 miles away. Benjamin stood next. I want to build bridges. Have you ever seen one being built? Nathaniel asked. The boy shook his head. No, Your Grace. But Miss Hale says not seeing a thing yet does not mean it cannot exist. One by one, the children spoke. A teacher, a bookkeeper, a gardener, a woman who owned her own shop. Nathaniel listened, though his eyes returned repeatedly to Margaret. She knew every answer before it was given. She knew when Ruth needed encouragement, when Benjamin required patience, and when Clara's confidence was beginning to fail. After the lesson, Nathaniel stepped outside with Margaret. Rain had stopped, leaving the yard silver with puddles. You arranged that display, he said. I arranged nothing. They knew precisely what to say. They knew precisely what they hoped. Hope does not finance buildings. Neither does indifference, though it destroys them efficiently. His expression hardened. You think me indifferent because I refuse to make decisions emotionally. Margaret looked through the window at the children gathering their books. What are their names? Whose names? The children you intend to move aside. Nathaniel hesitated. That is irrelevant. No, that is the entire difference between us. She stepped closer, her voice calm. You see 43 obstacles between your quarry and the road. I see Clara, whose mother nearly died. Benjamin, who wants to build what he has never seen. Ruth, who hides when she is frightened but reads better than anyone in her class. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Sentiment cannot govern an estate, and numbers cannot tell you whom they erase. She handed him the attendance list. He did not take it at first. Then he did. That is how powerful men destroy lives, Margaret said. Not through hatred, through the luxury of never learning their names. Nathaniel looked down at the page. For the first time since arriving in Bellweather, he had no immediate answer. Margaret turned back toward the schoolhouse, leaving him alone in the wet yard with 43 names in his hand. The floorboard beneath Margaret's desk gave way with a dry crack just after the last child had gone home. Dust rose through the dim classroom, while Mrs. Brooks hurried forward, but Margaret lifted one hand. I am not hurt. She knelt beside the broken plank and saw a strip of tarnished brass beneath the darkness. Together, the two women pried away the loose boards and uncovered a narrow wooden chest wrapped in oilcloth. The lock had rusted through long ago. Inside lay a bundle of ledgers, letters, and legal papers bearing the faded seal of the Blackwood estate. Margaret recognized her father's handwriting before she read a single word. For several moments, she could only stare. Dr. Jonathan Hale had been dead for 21 years, yet the careful lines of ink looked as steady as if he had left the room that morning. Margaret, Eleanor whispered, what is it? Margaret unfolded the first agreement. According to the document, her father had transferred nearly his entire savings to the previous Duke of Ravensshire during a financial crisis that threatened Blackwood Hall and its surrounding farms. In return, the Duke had granted the Bellweather School permanent use of the land for educational purposes. The building could be repaired, expanded, or rebuilt, but never reclaimed for private profit. Margaret read the clause twice. Then a third time. The school is protected, Eleanor said. It should be. Margaret turned to the final page. A jagged edge ran along the binding where another sheet had been removed. Without that page, the signatures and conditions might be challenged. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived to review the damage to the floor. Margaret placed the papers before him in the empty classroom. Sunlight fell across the desk between them, revealing every crease in the old parchment. He read in silence, his expression changing only when he saw his father's seal. Where did you find these? Beneath the floor. Convenient. Margaret's eyes lifted. You believe I placed them there? I believe an incomplete agreement appearing days before the estate takes possession requires careful examination. Careful examination is not the same as accusation. Nathaniel turned another page. The final authorization is missing. Someone removed it, or it never existed. The words settled heavily between them. Margaret had expected resistance. She had not expected him to doubt her so quickly. My father emptied his accounts to help your family, she said. That has not been established. His handwriting is on every page. Handwriting can be copied. Margaret stepped back as if distance might soften the insult. It did not. You came into my school without knowing one child's name. Now you read proof that my father protected your estate, and your first instinct is to call him dishonest. My first instinct is to protect the truth from sentiment. No, Your Grace. Your first instinct is to protect whatever allows you to remain unchanged. Nathaniel's face hardened. You presume too much. I have spent half my life being doubted by people who benefited from my silence. Margaret gathered the letters into a neat stack. Her hands did not tremble, though something inside her had gone cold. You will not be the last. She moved toward the door, but Nathaniel caught sight of a smaller envelope still inside the chest. It bore his father's private mark. He reached for it. The envelope was empty except for a single line written across the inside flap. The final covenant has been secured where no Blackwood heir will think to look. Nathaniel read the words twice. Margaret turned back. For the first time, uncertainty entered his eyes. "What does it mean?" she asked. He closed the envelope. "I do not know." "Then perhaps you should learn before destroying what your family once promised to protect." Nathaniel looked around the classroom, at the patched walls, the worn desks, and the names Margaret had written above each hook for the children's coats. He had thought the dispute concerned land. Now it concerned his father, her father, and a debt buried deeply enough to survive them both. Outside, church bells marked the hour. Inside, the Duke stood beside the open floor, holding evidence that his inheritance had been built upon a promise someone had tried to erase. 3 nights later, Blackwood Hall blazed with candlelight for the winter engagement dinner Nathaniel had planned long before the dispute over the school. The announcement of his intended marriage to Lady Caroline Whitmore was expected before midnight, and every influential family in the county had arrived to witness it. Margaret had no desire to attend. She came only because the missing agreement might be discussed among men who knew the history of the Blackwood estate, and because Nathaniel had requested that she bring the surviving documents. She entered the ballroom in a dark green gown borrowed from Eleanor, simple beside the silver silk and jeweled collars surrounding her. Conversations softened as she passed. Some guests recognized her as the schoolmistress. Others recognized her as the unmarried woman of 42 who had dared challenge a duke. Lady Caroline approached before Margaret reached the long table near the fireplace. She was elegant, composed, and young enough to wear confidence as though it had never been tested. "Miss Hale," Caroline said warmly, "how brave of you to come." Margaret met her smile. "I was invited." Of course. Nathaniel has always been generous toward worthy causes. The emphasis rested lightly on the final word. "I understand you have discovered some old papers beneath your school." "Legal papers." "Incomplete legal papers." Several guests turned toward them. Caroline lowered her voice just enough to make everyone listen harder. "It must be difficult to accept that the school may close. Still, grief can make people see promises where none were made." Margaret held the document case against her side. "Grief has never altered my eyesight." Caroline's smile did not move. "No, but loneliness sometimes alters judgment. A woman may mistake a gentleman's attention for personal concern, particularly when she has waited a very long time to receive either." The room seemed to narrow around Margaret. She heard the faint clink of glass, the hush between notes from the string quartet, and the delicate breath of someone suppressing laughter. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel had stopped beside the county magistrate. His eyes were fixed on them. He had heard. Margaret waited. One sentence from him would have ended the cruelty. He could have said the school documents deserved respect. He could have said her age was irrelevant. He could have said her presence was not an act of desperation. Nathaniel approached, his expression controlled. "Lady Caroline," he said, "this matter will be handled privately." Caroline lowered her gaze with graceful satisfaction. "As you wish." Margaret looked at Nathaniel. "Privately. This is not the place to discuss disputed records." It was apparently the place to discuss my dignity. His jaw tightened. "Margaret, do not make this more difficult." The use of her name should have felt intimate. Instead, it felt like another command. "I have spent 20 years making difficult things easier for everyone else," she said. "I will not make your silence easier too." She placed the document case on the table between them. From her small evening bag, she removed the faded train ticket she had kept since she was 22. Nathaniel looked down at it. "What is that?" "A life I postponed." Caroline glanced at the destination. "New York." Margaret nodded. "I purchased it before duty taught me to stay where I was needed." "The ticket cannot still be valid," Nathaniel said. "No, but the decision can be." Something shifted in his face. "You intend to leave Bellweather?" "I intend to stop waiting for this town to decide whether I am allowed a future." "And the school?" "Eleanor can protect it until the courts determine the truth." Nathaniel lowered his voice. "You would abandon everything over one unpleasant conversation?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "No, Your Grace. I am leaving because the one man who knew the conversation was unjust chose to protect the room instead of the woman standing in it." The quartet began another waltz. Couples turned toward the floor as though nothing had happened. Margaret slipped the train ticket back into her bag and walked toward the doors. No one stopped her. Nathaniel remained beside the evidence, surrounded by rank, candlelight, and the woman he was expected to marry, while the only person who had ever spoken to him without fear disappeared into the winter night. Margaret left Blackwood Hall before midnight, but Nathaniel remained in the ballroom long after the last guest had departed. The candles burned low around the unopened engagement announcement, and Lady Caroline's flowers had already begun to droop in their silver vases. He stood beside the table where Margaret had left the document case, hearing again the quiet certainty in her voice. The one man who knew the conversation was unjust chose to protect the room instead of the woman standing in it. At dawn, Nathaniel ordered every private ledger from his father's administration brought to the library. Mr. Charles Bennet worked beside him while rain pressed against the tall windows and the fire sank to embers. They searched deeds, correspondence, estate maps, and sealed accounts untouched for more than 20 years. Near noon, Bennet found a second key hidden beneath the lining of the late Duke's writing box. It opened a narrow iron compartment behind the portrait above the desk. Inside lay one folded covenant and a letter addressed to Nathaniel. His hands went still as he broke the brittle seal. The missing page completed the agreement exactly as Margaret had claimed. Her father had saved Blackwood Hall from financial collapse, and the school land had been granted permanently in return. The letter revealed something worse. Nathaniel's father had later concealed the agreement, fearing public shame if anyone learned that the Blackwood estate had survived because of a village doctor. He had used his influence to suggest that Jonathan Hale had mishandled charitable funds, allowing suspicion to follow the man until his death. Nathaniel read the confession twice. Then he saw a final line written in fading ink. "One day, my son, you may choose between preserving our name and making it worthy of preservation." Nathaniel closed his eyes. Margaret had not merely been doubted. Her entire adult life had been shaped by a lie carrying his family's seal. "Have the carriage prepared," he said. Bennet hesitated. "The station road is flooded. A horse may be faster." Nathaniel was in the saddle within minutes. He rode through rain and winter mud toward Bellweather station, the covenant secured beneath his coat. The platform came into view just as the morning train released a long white breath of steam. "Margaret," he called. Travelers turned. A porter pointed toward the departing cars. Nathaniel reached the platform as the last carriage passed beyond him. Through a rain-streaked window, he thought he saw a woman in a dark green coat seated beside the glass. Then the train curved east and disappeared between the bare trees. He stood without moving while the sound of the wheels faded into the distance. On the bench behind him lay a white handkerchief embroidered with a small blue M. Beneath it was the attendance list from the schoolhouse. 43 names. Nathaniel picked it up. Clara Bennett, Benjamin Shaw, Ruth Miller, names he had once called irrelevant. He read every one aloud while rain darkened the paper in his hands. The station master approached carefully. "Was there a message you wished me to send, Your Grace?" Nathaniel looked down the empty tracks. No, his voice was quiet. "She has heard enough promises from Blackwood men." He folded the list and placed it beside the covenant. "This time, she will see what I do without being asked." That afternoon, he returned to Blackwood Hall and ended his engagement to Lady Caroline. Before sunset, he halted the quarry road, summoned the estate attorneys, and ordered the school land restored under an independent educational trust. He also instructed them to clear Jonathan Hale's name in every public record where it had been questioned. Bennet watched him sign the final order. "Will you ask Miss Hale to return?" Nathaniel set down the pen. "No, you do not intend to follow her." Nathaniel looked toward the rain beyond the library windows. "Not until the truth reaches her before I do." For the first time in his life, the Duke understood that arriving too late was not the tragedy. The tragedy would be believing regret entitled him to another chance before he had earned it. 6 months after leaving Bellweather, Margaret stood before a classroom window in New York and watched morning light move across rooftops she had once known only from maps. The city was louder than anything she had imagined at 22. Wagons rattled over wet streets. Factory whistles sounded before sunrise. Voices rose from every direction, carrying accents from places she had never seen. At first, the noise had frightened her. Then it had begun to sound like possibility. She rented a small room above a dressmaker's shop and managed a school for working girls whose families could not afford private instruction. The building was narrow, the stairway steep, and the winter wind found every crack in the brick walls. Yet Margaret loved it. Her students studied reading, arithmetic, bookkeeping, science, and practical law. They learned how to sign contracts, calculate wages, and recognize when someone was cheating them. For the first time in her life, Margaret earned a salary that belonged entirely to her. She bought a blue wool coat without asking whether anyone else needed the money more. She chose books simply because she wanted to read them. On Sundays, she walked beside the river and returned to a room arranged according to her own preference. No one waited for supper. No one required medicine. No one called her selfish when she rested. The freedom was quiet, almost frightening, but it was hers. Nathaniel did not write to her. At first, Margaret believed his silence proved what she had always suspected. Then letters began arriving from Bellweather. Eleanor wrote that the quarry road had been canceled. Thomas reported that the school land had been placed in an independent trust beyond the Duke's control. The county newspaper printed a formal statement clearing Jonathan Hale of every accusation connected to the charitable accounts. The Blackwood estate admitted that his money had preserved the hall during its darkest financial year. Margaret read the article alone at her desk after the students had gone home. Her father's name stood in clean black ink, no longer shadowed by rumor. She pressed her fingers against the page and allowed herself to weep. Not because Nathaniel had restored what was stolen. Nothing could restore 21 years. She wept because he had done it while believing she might never return. Another letter came from Mr. Bennet confirming that Nathaniel had ended his engagement to Lady Caroline before any public announcement was made. He had sold part of the quarry interest and used the proceeds to repair the Bellweather school, but he had refused a place on its board. His Grace says a debt does not become generosity merely because it is repaid with ceremony, Bennet wrote. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She did not answer. In New York, her own work was growing. Enrollment had doubled, and a group of teachers asked her to help create a second school. Yet several wealthy donors opposed teaching science and financial management to poor young women. At the next board meeting, they intended to remove those subjects from the curriculum. Margaret prepared her arguments late into the night. She had faced aristocratic scorn before. This time, she would face it without waiting for anyone to stand beside her. On the morning of the meeting, she entered the assembly room carrying her ledgers and lesson plans. 12 board members sat behind a long table. One elderly banker looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Hale, your ambitions are admirable, but perhaps excessive." Margaret placed the student records before him. Education becomes excessive only to those who benefit from ignorance. Several faces tightened. She continued calmly, explaining wages, contracts, and the number of girls already promoted because of their training. When the chairman began to close the discussion, the doors at the back of the room opened. Margaret did not turn at first. Then every voice stopped. Footsteps crossed the wooden floor, measured and familiar. Nathaniel entered carrying a leather document case beneath one arm. He looked older than she remembered, less polished, and somehow more certain. He did not walk toward Margaret. He walked toward the board. "You asked whether Miss Hale is qualified to build a future," he said. "My family spent 20 years living upon the future she surrendered for others." Margaret's breath caught. Nathaniel placed the restored covenant, the public declaration clearing her father's name, and a legal trust agreement on the table. The funds enclosed belong to the Hale Educational Foundation. They carry no voting rights, no authority, and no conditions. The banker frowned. "And what does a British duke know of schools for working girls in New York?" Nathaniel looked at Margaret. "Enough to know that the wisest person in this room is the woman you nearly refused to hear." The boardroom remained silent after Nathaniel's declaration, but Margaret did not mistake silence for victory. The chairman adjusted his spectacles and studied the documents spread before him. "You are proposing a significant endowment," he said. "I am restoring funds that should have supported education long before today." Nathaniel's voice was calm. "The distinction matters." The elderly banker leaned back. "Money does not answer the concern before us. Miss Hale wishes to teach working girls bookkeeping, science, and contract law. Some consider such subjects unsuitable." Margaret stepped forward before Nathaniel could reply. "Then let them explain why ignorance is suitable." Her words crossed the room without force, yet every face turned toward her. These young women already work in shops, factories, offices, and private homes. They sign agreements they cannot read. They receive wages they cannot calculate. They are dismissed under terms they were never taught to question. Education does not make them unfit for life. It makes them harder to deceive. Nathaniel remained behind her. He did not interrupt. He did not complete her argument. That restraint mattered more than the authority he had brought into the room. One board member, a merchant with silver hair, tapped the lesson plans. "And you believe every girl requires science?" Margaret looked at him. "I believe curiosity should not become improper merely because it appears in a girl." A younger woman seated near the end of the table lowered her eyes to hide a smile. The chairman reviewed the trust agreement. "These funds carry no conditions." "None," Nathaniel said. "No Blackwood representative will hold a seat, appoint a teacher, or direct the curriculum." "Then why cross an ocean to deliver them personally?" The question finally turned the room toward what everyone had been wondering. Nathaniel glanced at Margaret, but his answer was addressed to the board. "Because my family once used distance to hide from responsibility. I did not intend to repeat that mistake." Margaret felt the old ache move beneath her ribs, not healed, but recognized. Nathaniel had not come to claim gratitude. He had come to place evidence where it could no longer be ignored. The chairman called for a vote. One hand rose in support of retaining the expanded curriculum. Then another. The merchant hesitated before lifting his own. When the final count was read, the science and financial courses remained. The endowment was accepted under Margaret's independent administration. The room emptied slowly, carrying away murmurs that sounded very different from those at Blackwood Hall. Margaret gathered her papers while Nathaniel waited near the door. He looked as though he had rehearsed 100 speeches and trusted none of them. "You should have written," she said. "I believed actions were required before words. And now I have no right to ask anything of you." Margaret closed the ledger. "You traveled 3,000 miles to say that." "I traveled because the documents belonged in your hands." He placed the restored covenant before her. Beneath it lay the public declaration clearing her father's name. "And because I wanted to see the life you chose when no one was asking you to sacrifice it." Margaret studied him. The polished certainty had changed. He was still a duke, still a man accustomed to command. But there was humility in the way he stood beyond the threshold rather than entering farther without invitation. "The school is growing," she said. "I can see that. We plan to open another next year. Then Bellweather may learn from New York." "Bellweather has much to learn." A faint warmth touched his expression. "So do I." Rain traced the tall windows behind them, softening the city into gray and gold. Margaret rested one hand on the covenant. "You defended me today." "No," Nathaniel said. "I supported the truth you had already spoken." The answer reached her more deeply than praise would have. She looked toward the open door. "There is a small restaurant across the street. The coffee is terrible." "That sounds difficult." "You once accused me of making difficult things personal." "I was wrong about many things." Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. "Then begin with the coffee." Nathaniel waited until she stepped beside him. Together they left the boardroom, not as savior and rescued woman, not as duke and schoolmistress, but as two people entering a conversation that neither power nor loneliness could finish for them. 1 year later, the Bellweather Educational Society held its first transatlantic fundraising ball in a restored hall overlooking the Hudson River. The room glowed beneath chandeliers, yet Margaret no longer stood at its edge arranging flowers for other people. She entered beside Eleanor Brooks, wearing a midnight blue gown she had chosen for herself, and watched former students present plans for new schools in New York and Bellweather. Clara had begun medical training. Benjamin had earned an apprenticeship with a bridge engineer. Ruth, once too frightened to speak before strangers, now taught reading to factory girls in the evenings. Their names appeared in the printed program. Nathaniel had remembered every one. During the year, he had crossed the Atlantic 4 times, never arriving without work to do. He studied school accounts, negotiated fair leases, and learned to ask before offering assistance. Margaret disagreed with him often. He disliked unnecessary risk. She disliked caution disguised as wisdom. Their arguments traveled through letters, meetings, train stations, and long walks beside the river. Neither hurried what had begun too late in life to survive carelessness. When the musicians announced the final waltz, Margaret felt an old memory stir. Once, she had stood outside a ballroom while others spoke of her future as though it had already ended. Now the dancers paused to make room for her. Nathaniel approached without his title preceding him. Silver had spread farther through his dark hair, and New York had softened none of the dignity in his bearing, but he no longer carried silence like armor. He stopped before Margaret and offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" She looked at him with measured amusement. "Do you know how old I am, Your Grace?" 43. You remembered. "I have become very serious about names and numbers." She placed her hand in his. "Then you also know I have lived too long to be impressed by a title. That is fortunate. I have spent the year attempting to become more than one." They stepped onto the floor. Nathaniel moved with careful restraint, allowing Margaret to set the distance between them. Around them, silk and black coats turned beneath the chandeliers, but the room seemed quieter than any place they had shared. "Bellweather needs you," he said. Margaret's expression changed. "I will not return because I am needed." "I know." His answer came without hesitation. "New York needs you as well. So do the schools we have not yet opened." "And what do you need?" Nathaniel met her eyes. "A place in the life you chose. Not at its center. Not above it. Beside you, if you decide there is room." Margaret studied the man who had once entered her town to take away the school, the man who had doubted her father, failed her publicly, and then repaired what he could without demanding forgiveness. "I will not abandon my work," she said. "I would not ask you to. I will keep my own income. Of course. And when you are wrong, I will tell you." A faint smile reached his eyes. "That appears unavoidable." The music slowed. Margaret glanced toward the tall windows, where the city burned with thousands of lights. At 22, she had purchased a ticket toward this life and believed duty had taken it from her forever. At 42, she had finally used it. At 43, she understood that love did not require her to return the life she had claimed. It only asked whether she wished to share the road ahead. "There may be room," she said. Nathaniel's hand tightened gently around hers, no more than the dance required. "Old enough to know your own mind," he murmured. "And you?" Margaret asked. "Old enough to be grateful when someone changes it." They continued beneath the chandeliers, while the final waltz carried them past every gaze that had once reduced a woman's future to her age. Margaret did not feel chosen. She felt seen. 42 had not been the age at which her life ended. It had been the age at which she finally stopped living only for everyone else.